exactly 7 o'clock. And Dan is going to be on the video machine, so he asked for me to introduce. We're going to do it very speedy quick because we want Linda to be able to have the whole hour, or as much of it that she needs. So we want to thank her. She did the raffle basket at the same time she's doing her presentation. So thanks to Linda. Cookies are from Kathy Bevilaqua Wines, wherever she's seated. And Marianne Trigg, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. So we're going to skip the museum reports tonight so we could get straight to her presentation. The restrooms, if you're not accustomed to this place, if you go straight back through, you can see the women's restroom, straight back that way. And we want to let you know that KVMR has, if you go to archives, you go to kvmr.com or .org, you can go click on listen and click on archives, and that she has 3 hours of popular music from World War I. And that's all I need. So okay. Richard's going to speak, and then Linda. So big hand for Linda. She's been working so hard.
The she in question that Carolyn just mentioned is T.J. Meekins, and she did a show for KVMR, a fundraiser, and they have it archived at the station. And it deals with the history of music that was popular during the war, and also actually goes into the development of recorded music as a sidebar. So if you're interested in that, it's a very interesting show. Linda has asked me to say a few words about the exhibit that's going up at the Rue Center. You can see here, these are the panels that we're working on now, and you can see that it's being visited by the blue Michelin tire family, which I put together just to give me something that's like a human scale. But the panels tell the story of World War I with a real local emphasis. So you have enough context so that if you're not familiar with the war, you know, this will fill you in and give you the picture of what's happening abroad and nationally, but it's really the local version of it. It really did impact Nevada County very dramatically, and a group of us have been working on telling that story, and you'll hear a lot of it from Linda in just a moment. Well, let's just click on this guy and see if he wants to go. Okay, we will have some artifacts. You can see there's a case that we just acquired, and there's going to be a full uniform over there in that bird case. Oh, yeah, and these are fill-in posters before I actually had the exhibit designed, and that's the Kaiser endorsing Nevada City as a tourist destination. Didn't know that he had such an interest in it. And then, I don't know if this will be ready for the opening, but we will have materials like the movies that Linda just showed in that little alcove where they currently have emergency service information. And I think there's one more. Yeah, okay. And that's about it. So here's Linda to give you the actual details of Nevada County in World War I.
Sure.
Change gears here for a second. My very old computer. Set this down for a second. I did this white on a solid color to make it more visible, but maybe we could have a little light down just to, because there'll be some areas where it's going to be a little harder to see. More. Yeah, I don't need any light, so I'm fine. Okay, so the title of our overall program is over here, Nevada County's Experience of World War I. I want to first thank the California Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities for a grant they awarded us, which has allowed this to actually happen. Also, Jeff Leiter, David Bard, and Rudy Cesar have also contributed, so we would like to thank them for that. And I've had a wonderful team of Gage McKinney, Richard Hurley, Orlo Steele, and Maria Brower, plus all the folks at the Stirls Historical Library, Pat Breda, and at Doris Foley as well. So all of those people have been doing wonderful things, and I've relied heavily on the archives at Cyril's. And Pat, I will do a mea culpa up front, but I got so busy I forgot to go back and do all the credits, but they will appear on the photos at some point, so you'll know them when you see them. So let's get started. The title of my talk is Lest We Forget. And this is a collage done by my dear friend Kathy Davis, because one of the things that has struck me when I've been doing this work is that all of these people were young people, and they were just out of high school. So at some point, I thought it would just be appropriate to try to remember who they were the year before or 2 years before they took on this incredible responsibility, went across a continent and an ocean and went to war. So I'm going to show a lot of photos in this talk that are not necessarily people in uniform, and that's why. The other day, Gage and I were on the Tom Fitzsimmons show, and he asked me, how did I ever get interested in this topic? A couple reasons. One, I lived in an area in Menlo Park where Camp Fremont used to be, and that was a World War I training camp right next to Stanford. They thought, and perhaps were right, that the foothills looked a lot like the hills of France, so they dug trenches and exploded artillery and otherwise made a big mess of what is now part of the Stanford campus. But also, when I first visited Memorial Park at Grass Valley and saw the memorial grow there to our World War I veterans, it struck me that when the sort of pickleball controversy came up a year ago, November, which was happily resolved by the city and the veterans and everybody else, I think, no one talked about the man whose tree and plaque were in question. And I don't remember that his name ever came up in any of the discussions about this issue. And that sort of saddened me, and I wanted to figure out who he was. So I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce you to Anthony Joseph Bevilaqua, whose tree you see and whose little plaque is at the base of the tree. Because his was an exceptionally sad story. He was one of 3 boys. He was 17, had brothers that were 15 and 12. His father, Joseph, was an Italian farmer off the Colfax Highway now. His mother, Madeline, was born in California, but she was the daughter of Italian immigrants. And when, in 1912, Joseph's cart turned over and the wheels ran over him and broke his back. He went into the Jones Hospital, but by November, this I think was early fall, it was very clear he was not going to ever walk again. His wife, Madeline, who was, I think 16 years his junior, went into despair, tried to commit suicide by drowning herself, was unsuccessful. They took her to the county hospital, and that night she snuck out in the middle of the night and they found her dead, drowned the next morning. 2 days later, her best friend, Rose Hume, who lived at Allison Ranch Road, also committed suicide. So here were these 3 teenage boys, well, not even, one of them not even a teenager, who had charge of their father to take care of him. He never did walk, and he was taken back to their small farm. So Mr. Bevilaqua lived till 1916 when he died, and 6 months later Anthony got drafted into the war. And he went up to Fort Lewis in Washington to train and then went to France. And very sadly, within a couple of months of arriving in France, he died of pneumonia. So his story was a tragic one in so many ways. And I just felt it sort of added to the tragedy that he wasn't remembered. So that's the longest and I think saddest individual story I'm going to tell you, but I just thought we should know who he was. So when the 1910 census came around, this was a community of immigrants. As you can see, we were mostly white, mostly male, and only 39% of our population were born here, were born in the US, and had native-born parents. 30% of us, like Anthony, had one or both parents who were foreign-born, and 24% of us were foreign-born. We were also a relatively small community, just under 15,000 people. And just as a comparison, today Nevada County has just under 99,000 people. So it was a large enough community that people probably didn't know everybody, but it was also small enough that people knew a lot about what was going on in their community and who lived here. And this, this foreign-born issue would become important when war broke out, because so many of our residents had family and friends that were still in the countries that were going to war. So although the war was going to be far removed from Nevada County for a good long while, people were already in the very early weeks and months of the war getting notification that their brothers, cousins, uncles had been drafted or were enlisting, and some were already in danger. So just keep that sort of population in mind. Now this is an unreadable slide, so you don't have to read it, but I wanted you to get a sense of how quickly things happened when this war broke out. The opening salvo was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, who you see over there, in an open car, and his wife Sophie was also killed by the assassin. That started a series of what was called the July Crisis, in which all of the players in Europe who'd been positioning or who were unhappy with what happened in the last war began to move. And so this happened so quickly that from July 28th to 1 month later, basically all of Europe was at war, and so was Japan and Russia, continental Europe plus Russia. So this was a hugely accelerated process, and that title, The Guns of August, that comes from Barbara Tuchman's book on the subject, but basically the world went from peace to war in a matter of a month. And it was indeed from the very beginning a world war, because most of the European, all of, I think, these principal European countries were also colonies, had colonies. So Africa, for example, there were 6 different parts of Africa that were under the Belgian, French, or German, or English control. The Middle East was as well, and even America, although not a traditional colonial power, we had the Philippines. So for all intents, it was a colony to us. And Filipino soldiers went to war in France on our behalf, and Filipino workers went to our ports in Honolulu and other port cities, so that when we got in the war, other people could leave those jobs and go. Now, most of our immigrants in this county were from Great Britain or her dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So we had a substantial number of men in this county who in 1914 went to war, not for us, not for the US, but for their home countries. And there were British recruiters here all the time in this county, especially looking for our Cornish miners who had the skills of tunneling, handling explosive, controlling hydraulics, all of these skills that were going to be needed and were needed on the battlefronts in Europe. So we had one recruiter who we think got almost 50 recruits out of Nevada County, but there were several recruiters here all the time. And there were joint US-British recruiting events that happened later on when we got in the war. So why did America go to war? There were a number of reasons. The Germans had, very early on in the war, started sinking anything that moved, including, in this case, the passenger ship Lusitania, a British ship, but was thought to, and I think did, have armaments on board. There were 128 Americans on board the Lusitania, and Americans were outraged that this had happened. The Germans backed off in a sense for a while, but by February 1st of 1917, they had gone to unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant that anything they thought needed sinking was going to get sunk. Also, there was this thing called the Zimmermann telegram, which was an intercepted telegram from the German government to the Mexican government, basically offering that if Mexico came in on the side of Germany, that they would nicely carve up the Southwest and give it back to Mexico. And we had just been at war with Pancho Villa, after all, so this did not seem far-fetched at all to Californians. And indeed, on the rail links, the Colfax, the gold links, there were the trains that were hauling the gold were guarded by the local militia just for that reason. So it seems maybe silly to us, but it wasn't silly then. And finally, we, as Terry Beacons pointed out on her radio show recently, Europe owed us a whole lot of money. We were loaning money like crazy to fund Britain and France, and if they didn't win the war, we would be out a lot of money. So it was certainly some motivation. So on April 6th, America declared war on Germany. And we weren't ready for it. America had a standing army of about 100,000 men, a National Guard of about 150, and no infrastructure whatsoever to take an army off to war. So a number of camps were established all over the country. In California, Camp Fremont near Palo Alto, Camp Kearney down near San Diego were the two where most of our people went. And then a lot of our people also went up to Washington State, to Fort Lewis. But you can see the whole country was either converted National Guard camps or brand new ones. And America didn't have a draft. And the last time we'd had one, during the Civil War, it went really badly. For starters, people could buy themselves out of the draft, pay people to go for them. This made people who didn't have a lot of money pretty unhappy. There were riots, and it really went very badly. So this time around, the government was determined that we would have to have, well, first they were going to try recruitment only. But if that didn't work, they already had plans to bring in a draft. So the recruitment posters that you probably all have seen, especially James Montgomery Flagg's iconic one on the left, were put out by a group called the Committee on Public Information. It was the first propaganda effort, I think, ever. Managed by a man by the name of George Creel, who'd come out of was a progressive, newspaper fellow. He was really good at his job. And hundreds of thousands of these posters flooded the country. Some were just patriotic, like the one you see on the left, and some were intended to demonize the country that we were about to go to war to. So the use of the gorilla with the German helmet and the maiden in his arms, a la King Kong, or King Kong is a la this, I suppose, were pretty common motifs. Now, we already had a few people in service when war broke out. One of them on the left, that's Clarence Thomas. He had graduated from Annapolis and was actually serving off the coast of Mexico, which was still a troubled area as far as we were concerned. And the one on the right, he went by Ross, so usually see it T. Ross Cooley. He was a midshipman at Annapolis, and that year the Academy accelerated the completion of the program so that they finished 2 months early. Clarence Thomas was transferred to the gunnery detail. He headed up the gunnery detail on a commercial ship, the SS Vacuum, that was going across the Atlantic. And they were sunk by a German submarine. And Thomas and his crew, who had been on duty frantically day and night the whole cruise, because it was a very treacherous crossing, they were thrown into the water. The ship was sunk. He helped get everybody he could into the boats. It was very heavy seas, and eventually he was pulled into the boat. But by that time, he was badly injured, and probably the waters were frigid in that area. And he died overnight and was buried at sea. And he is the first naval officer to die in World War I. He was from Grass Valley. Fortunately, T. Ross Cooley went on to serve and lived through the war. But when we declared war, there was incredibly enthusiastic participation from many young men, including this list. This fellow here is James Roach. That's his high school annual. And they enlisted right away, many of them, both in the Navy and in the Army, went into the National Guard. We also had one person who had volunteered before that, and that was Edward Everett, who volunteered, was a Berkeley student and volunteered to go drive ambulance in France. He was recruited by William Bourne, who was a Francophile and very active in pro-French activities, including getting an ambulance service set up in France. But eventually it was obvious that conscription was going to be needed to fill the Army. We needed, the government thought, 1 million men under arms, so we needed to go from 100,000, well, 250,000 if you count the National Guard, to 1 million. So conscription came in. The first round was in June 1917, and that was for all men between the ages of 21 and 39 had to register, even if they weren't really eligible to serve. So our foreign-born registered as well, and that gives us a wonderful source of data for knowing who those people were. A second draft round came out a year later, in which they picked up the men who had turned 21 between the first draft and this one. And then finally in September of 1918, they expanded the age bracket from 18 to 45. Now this went surprisingly smoothly, given our experience in the Civil War. And that was because these were, draft boards were administered locally. And the person that was in charge of your draft board was your neighbor or your minister or your boss sometimes, your teacher. So you didn't have the sort of feeling that the heavy hand of the federal government was coming down. So it went relatively well. There were some pockets of the country not so well, but mostly it was a very smooth process. So this is the first cohort that left Nevada County. These were men who'd registered on June 5th, 1917. And this is October 6th, 1917. And that's on Broad Street. And although you can't see the content, at the upper sort of right-hand middle of the screen, you see some big posters on that fence back there. Well, all of our towns would have been just covered with these propaganda posters, including recruitment posters. So this group of men included some from Sierra County. You can probably tell these are not all young men, so who are these old gentlemen up there? Well, town fathers were there for sure, but also veterans of other wars, including the Civil War. So the Spanish-American War and Civil War veterans came out to say goodbye. The whole town came out as well. They all marched from Broad Street to the railway depot on Railroad Avenue. The band, Grass Valley Concert Band, was here, and they all went to the station. Then they all got boarded onto the train, went on to Grass Valley to pick up people there, and that town had virtually closed down. Schools were out, businesses closed. The band went on the train with the boys. So they headed up then to Fort Lewis in Washington, and that would be the first contingent of our people that were away. So, who do we have here? Anybody recognize this handsome lad? Alan Chapman. Alan was an airman. He never actually went overseas that I am aware of. But he did train. He was taught flight school in Texas. And I'm going to turn my little cheat light on just for a second, because one of the things that happened up here, there was no radio, no television, no internet, obviously. And the only way people knew what was going on was if the paper published it. So they had a column called Our Boys at Camp, and these young guys would write into the paper or write home, and their family would bring the papers in, the letters in, and then they would publish them in the paper. So I'm going to read a little bit of one of Alan's. He was a very good writer, and pretty much one thing that figured in every one of his letters was candy. So people were always sending him candy, and he was happy for that. Whoops. Maybe technology challenged here. All right. So I'm just going to read a little bit. He wrote very differently when he was writing to his mother than he did to his father. So I'm going to read one to Dad, because it has all the juicy bits about the airplanes crashing. So he's writing here about training school, and he said, all the cadets had been called on account of bad weather, and we went out with another. He got into a stall while making a turn and came crashing to the ground. Nobody was hurt, but at last somebody has been killed, an automobile. Someone was apparently driving by watching the planes and crashed and his car overturned. So Alan writes reassuringly, today 2 soloists broke up their ships, but they were not hurt. You see, flying is safer than automobiling. The first man killed in this place was killed by an automobile. There must have been a change of some kind in the schedule. So Alan wrote home a lot, and he wrote very chatty letters. So one of the things that you find about men from the West is this sort of mythic view of who they were. And this is from Easterners' perspective. And it wasn't just California, but even men from Nebraska, which we don't probably think of as the West, were thought to be Westerners. And Willa Cather talks about this in some essays she's written about her hometown. So this is from a history of the 40th, the Sunshine Division. And what was the constitution of the Western soldier? The bone and sinew of the Great West, full of its boldness, replete with its spirit of initiative and practicality. These men were of unsurpassed physique, hardy and enduring. They were thought to be crack shots. They could fell a tree and do all sorts of practical things. And one of my very favorite images from Cyril's, this is Cecil Randolph Kearns on the right. His father had a livery service in Nevada City, and this is, I believe, taken at Camp Kearney when he was in basic training. So he just kind of lives up to that spirit, I think. So I'm just going to talk briefly about two divisions that a number of our soldiers went into. They actually served in dozens and dozens of different units and in all parts of the world, including China, Siberia, and the Philippines. But a lot of them went into the 40th Division and the 91st Division. The 91st was known as the Wild West Division because it had men from the western states. And supposedly their slogan is "Powder River, let 'em buck." And this was apparently because the Wyoming lad who joined came to camp with his chops on still. And when someone asked him, he shouted out, "Powder River, let 'em buck." And so that's the slogan they adopted. This is Camp Lewis in Washington. It was an enormously created place. It didn't exist. Prior to the war, it held 30,000 people and had, everything you could possibly need to have a new city. And lots of our fellows went there. And they ended up serving in two regiments that I'll talk about in a bit, the 363rd and the 362nd. The Sunshine Division was another story. And just let me look for something else I'm going to read you briefly. It was, came out of the California National Guard. And unlike a lot of divisions, it did not get to Europe until late. Didn't get there till August of 1918. And rather than having the men serve together, they used them as a depot command where they could, there were so many losses in the other divisions that they would use the 40th men to go fill in, which meant they didn't have that opportunity to serve together that a lot of them did. And there's a kind of a wistful tone in their regimental history about that. I'll just read a little bit. They said their graves, speaking of their men, their graves are on every field that bear witness to the valor of American arms in Europe. They now bear worthily and loyally the insignia of the most noted organizations in our army. As they carried away from us our abiding and affectionate interest, we know they have carried with them an abiding and affectionate loyalty to the organization that trained them and sent them forth. And you may recognize some names: Cliff Carveth, August Jarsky, Einar Narkevis, and William Bree all served in the 40th. So how do you get 1 million men across an ocean? Well, the problem was America didn't have the ships to do it. We had small ships. England was starved for coal, so they didn't have any over there. So a ship had to have a bunker that could haul enough coal for a return trip, because there was no place to coal in the middle of the North Atlantic. So initially, our men went on a lot of British liners. This one that you see here is the Leviathan. She was originally German, part of the Hamburg line, who had the misfortune of being in New York Harbor the day Germany declared war. She was kept in the harbor, but not confiscated until we declared war. But then she was converted to a troop ship. She was one of the more luxurious of the troop ships. So many were much worse than she. And here she's wearing her dazzle, this camouflage that they painted the ships to help distract submarines when they were at sea. And there's just some amazing examples of dazzle on the web if you want to amuse yourself. I think they're fascinating. So the first group of men left early June. The first large contingent of men left early June from Hoboken. The Americans had no idea how to do this. It was a bit of a disaster. The poor guys had to stand in the sun for days and days. Eventually they moved them to a field which was right next to a tannery. So by the time they got on board, one observer said they would welcome a submarine over what they just experienced. But it didn't take long for us to figure it out, and we began moving people en masse. So I'd like just to take a little interlude and show you some people so you can imagine who these folks are. Most of these people are fairly well identified, but not 100%. So if you recognize people, and I've got the names wrong, do see me afterward. So here's just a few. This is Alfred and Samuel Bennett on the left. They're brothers. Lou Wanamaker in the Navy, obviously. Harold Granger and Lauren Moody, who are apparently friends, not related as best I can tell, and they're actually wearing welcome home ribbons. So they went and came back. Henry Parks Everett on the right, he was brother to Edward Everett, our ambulance driver. Frank Nyland, you may recognize the name, and Merritt Robert Nickerson. Dr. Carl Jones, who I think it says sorry, there's a different Jones name on the back of the photo, but I can't find that any of the other Jones men were in the Navy, so we'll have to figure him out. Donald Grover, who was a Marine. And we also had at least 2 of our Nissinon people here who served in the war. Trying to nail Shelley down to ID these people, absolutely. But you can see they're wearing vestiges of their uniforms, the one on the far left and the one kneeling in front of him. And I believe this is Hubert and Jerome Potts. Both of them actually served in France. Will Sigourney, and on the right, maybe John, maybe Frank, maybe Fred Nettles. Not sure, but hoping to verify these guys. Then 2 of the young men that we lost, sadly, were William Hague and William Hegarty. William Hague was the managing director, I guess was the right title, of the North Star Mine. He certainly had no need to enlist, but he did enlisted early. And so did many others from the mine, Lawrence Brasher, Roy Temrow, and others. He, unfortunately, when he got to France, got pneumonia and died very quickly. William Hegarty actually served in France, and he died in battle before the major offensive I'm going to talk about in a minute. So here's what I mentioned earlier. This is General Pershing. He was personally picked by President Wilson to serve as the commander. He had had actual experience on the Mexican frontier. He'd gone after Pancho Villa. I don't recall that he actually caught him, but there had been, well, we had people from the Spanish-American War, but Wilson really wanted Pershing, and he jumped him up over hundreds of other officers that were more senior than he. So Pershing was a West Point graduate, and he was there at a time when, believe it or not, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman were still alive at the end of their lives, when he was a very young cadet. So he was raised on the spirit of the Civil War. That was the war that most impressed him. And he really believed that an American soldier with a gun, a good gun, and a bayonet could do whatever needed doing. And he was very suspicious and contemptuous that the French and British had dug in to the trench warfare that had characterized the Western Front for so many years. Now, I just spent some time with a couple of British historians who basically thought that Pershing was just really naive, at least at the beginning. and was reluctant to listen to the French or British, who had some experience with this, the best army in the world, the Germans. But nevertheless, Pershing did not want to have any Americans serving under French or British, except in a training capacity. And he was backed up by our Secretary of War. So when we went overseas, the intent was to avoid at all costs having to put American soldiers under any of the Allied commanders, although this happened on some occasions when they were now desperate for new troops. So off our army went, and we began gathering on the continent in early summer. Now, I do have to talk about the Marines, because we have at least one in the room. The Marines actually got into the war much earlier than most of the American Army at a place called Belleau Wood. It was an incredibly brutal battle that lasted, I think, for almost the whole month of June, or at least 3 weeks of the month. And the little picture on the right is Belleau Wood in September of this year. And the one on the left is what it looked like after the battle. And the Marines were finally successful, but sometimes at the end it just came down to fists and bayonets, I think is the way it's been characterized. And there's two really famous quotes that come out of this wood. I'm sure Arlo could probably tell me what they are, but I do have a cheat sheet here. Just bear with me for a second. So one of them, which you've probably heard both of these before, when I guess Sergeant Dan Daly was about to take his troops in, he said, "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" And the other one, when the French tried to get Captain Lloyd Williams to retreat, he said, "Retreat, hell, we just got here." Do I have those right, Orla?
Absolutely right.
So those have gone down in Marine Code lore. So now, if you're at a bar and you have that question come up, you'll know. But the one major offensive I'm going to talk about now is something called the Argonne Offensive. By this time, General Foch, the French general, was in charge of the Allied army, and he finally thought that with the arrival of the American troops, that they had an opportunity to finally push the Germans out of France, where they'd been entrenched for 3 years. And this is a little picture again of the Argonne. The Argonne is a wood. It's a large area, and it's a lot of rolling hills. Looks a little bit maybe not as green, but like our southern foothills further down the hill, with wooded areas. It was very, very difficult terrain to fight in. Alvin York, who you may have heard of, Gary Cooper played him in the movie, would later say, God would never be cruel enough to create a cyclone so terrible as that Argonne battle. Only man would ever think of doing an awful thing like that. So basically what the offensive was, there was an 18-mile front, 1.2 Americans lined up across the front, and their job was to get to Sedan, which is, I don't have, sorry, my little thing didn't work, but way up at the top is Sedan. The first big dark line, that's the front on September 26th. The second dark line is the front, I think around, let's see, I can't see from here. Anyway, yes, thank you, October 31st. And then the final one is on November 11th. So what these little squares or rectangulars, each of those is a division. There were 22 American divisions that were going to go into this campaign. And they all had their little sector to maintain. That's much easier said than done in war. So I'm going to show you some original pictures at the time. This is the Argonne Wood with some soldiers reconnoitering down there on the corner. This is a group of Americans in a trench. They're getting ready to go up and out, sometimes called waiting to jump, sometimes over the top. Well, that's usually out of a different kind of trench, but. And then there was the issue of how do you move 1 million men, and I think I read somewhere 90,000 horses. This army was mechanized in some ways, but not in most ways. Ambulances, artillery, food wagons, everything was pulled by horses or mules. This area is full of little villages with little one road in and out, and you can imagine how that breaks down in the middle of a battle. Speaking of horses, so this is a Red Cross aid station, and horses are permitted as well, I guess. So they had these in bombed out areas, semi-safe from the front, where people who were wounded could go back and get a little respite. So this offensive began on September 26th. At 2:30 in the morning, the American-French artillery began. It went on for till 5:30 in the morning. Something like 6 million shells, more ammunition than the entire Union Army fired during the whole Civil War, went sailing over the heads of the Americans into the Germans. At 5:30, they left their security, whatever they were, fine. They were huddled under woods and in little ravines, and went to war. The 91st Division, which, well, I won't put it back, was sort of in the middle of the pack, and those included a lot of Nevada County's boys. They had drilled together, trained together. They had never been in combat before they went into this offensive. But they did remarkably well, and they pushed forward, gained about 5 miles, which in this war was an amazing amount of distance, and found themselves out too far because the divisions that were on their flanks didn't keep the same pace. So they're pretty much trapped for about 2 or 3 days. They had no water, no food, no ambulances, but they really hung on, and were later quite complimented for their tenacity and ability to do that. And General Pershing had his wish. These were just American men through all those battalions, just charging out with guns and bayonets, and they really did not anticipate the force of the German machine guns, which were all hidden throughout this. The Germans had been in this area for a long time. So it was a very long, bloody battle. It lasted 47 days, but by November 11th, they had achieved their objective of getting up to Sedan at the top of that map. And basically, the Germans were brought to the bargaining table. The price was really high. About 27,000 Americans were killed in 47 days, and about 96,000 were wounded. And people still today talk about whether Pershing's tactics were right or wrong, but they were effective for sure. So I want to talk a little bit about our community, because I think we can all imagine that today in a modern community, if 2 high school students are killed in an accident, like a car accident we had here last year, it opens a hole in the community. But our community was just 15,000 people. And so the losses that we experienced in this war, but especially in this campaign, must have been wrenching. So these were the men that died in this first part of this campaign. The portrait is of Albert Pinkham. He was, we think, the first person